Well, good afternoon. It is January of 2025, and we are going to interview JoAnne Kelty, who has graciously accepted our invitation. And she is currently the pastor of the Minneapolis Congregation here in the Headwaters Mission Center. So just like we have with the other folks, JoAnne, I'm just going to ask you a series of questions. I'm asking everybody the same thing to try to keep our focus focused. So thank you again. And the first question is just tell me a little bit about your religious upbringing.
I grew up in a small town in northern Minnesota, and the uh, church was the Christian Reformed Church, which is a Calvinist type church. Um, and as I often say, I think I've been member of a dying congregation for most of my life because most of the people, the young people, had all moved away from the small farm community onto better opportunities. And I actually did not really attend church as such because my mother had a fight with the pastor about my sister's wedding. And but we did have something that we called Friday school from first through eighth grade. There was release time from school for an hour every Friday morning. And we walked over to the church and had a class over there. So that was my 8 years of uh, religious upbringing there. I knew which church I belonged to and was supposed to attend if I ever attended a church service. And the one thing that one of the ministers really did for me that affected my life was in maybe seventh or eighth grade. He had us outline the New Testament, one of the books in the Bible, and I don't remember right now which it was, but that was our homework for every week was to read and create an outline of the book of the Bible. So I learned a whole lot that way. And my mother had bought this 10-volume edition of Stories of the Bible, which I read from beginning to end because I was a voracious reader. And so I had an overview of the whole Old Testament, New Testament by the time I was in high school. So that was my religious connections.
That's amazing. That is quite a foundation, whether you were in an actual building every week or not. But so the school let all the kids out, or was it only certain
No,
kids?
all the schools, that was something in the 19 late 50s, early 60s that the schools did. The Catholic, Lutheran, and Christian Reformed, we all, every Friday morning, they weren't teaching religion, but they were giving release time for the kids to be able to go over to their churches and study with whoever their minister was. That
That's
and I don't know whatever happened to that, but that was kind of common with at least some of the rural schools up in northern Minnesota.
that's quite amazing. That's quite amazing, really.
I think that's something that, I'd be surprised if schools did it now, but the churches
Yeah,
aren't really prepared to handle that either. So,
true, true. So, what was your first interaction with the RLDS or Community of Christ, as we are now called, church?
um, okay, this might be a bit longish because there were several interactions. I met my husband up in Bemidji State College. It was a college then, not university. And he was a member of the RLDS church at that point. Now, in Bemidji at that time, at least initially, there was not a RLDS congregation. So we kind of explored other churches. We went to the Methodist Church, the Baptist Church, the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church. And then my Dan connected with somebody who let him know that there was a small group of RLDS members up there who were meeting in homes. And they met in the summertime or spring, fall, summer, and not in the winter when the person who was pastoring it went to Oregon for the winter.
Hmm.
So, Blinn and Muriel Anderson, Bertha Anderson, the Kronemillers, there might have been one other people. And so when Dan found that out, uh, we somebody from one of those people would pick us up and bring us to usually the Kronemiller's farm, and we'd have a Sunday meeting. And so that was my first connection. We continued, we mostly wound up with the Presbyterian church, and we were married in the Presbyterian church
Okay.
there. So that was the first connection. And my first time I was kind of upset with the church because we had been going together for 2 years and Dan asked me to marry him. And so I was all excited the next time we were at church. And I said, "Hey, we're engaged." And Miss Bertha flipped over. Well, she didn't say it quite that way, but she says, "Oh, wonderful. And the only thing that would make it perfect was it would be if you were baptized." And I'm going, okay, I'm perfectly happy right now. Baptism wasn't even a consideration at that point, but yes, that was my first connection. I'll continue with the story a little bit because then we were married and moved out to California, Temple City. There was a congregation there where Dan's parents attended. Um, More members, well, Dan's where he was baptized and where he was a member of, along with his older brother. And for that year that we were in California, Dan was in the Navy Reserve. That was the time of Vietnam. So he was doing his basic training and so on and so forth. So I went to church then with Dan's mother. And partly that when he was gone, well, and when he was there as well. We attended Sunday school and then we left. We did not attend church services because they didn't like, or his mother didn't like the preaching and so on and so forth, but she liked the classes and discussion. And so that's what we did. Um, and that was kind of it was interesting and stuff, but that's what we did with Dan's mother. Then to move on a little bit, we moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan for Dan to attend grad school to get his master's in library science. And so we started out, okay, we're going to start out again exploring different churches to find which church we want. And we had gone to the Christian Reformed Church, and then we went to the RLDS Church, and we had a list of other churches that we were going to go to. But that first Sunday when we went to the RLDS Church, it was the daylight savings time change. We got there, of course, an hour early.
Mhm.
And fortunately, there were two other people, and we sat and talked with them for an hour, and they made us so welcome. And then they had a potluck afterwards, and they made us so welcome. And then we had one of the people invited us to come to their house on a Wednesday night for dinner. Because the Ann Arbor was a college town,
Mhm.
they wanted to do outreach ministry to college students. And so they were inviting all of the college students to their home for um, for dinner, just come have dinner and whatever. And like, okay, we'll do that. Because, we didn't know anybody in town anyway. It was
Mhm.
all
Mhm.
college and getting to know people. So this is where everything flipped because we went that Wednesday night to dinner. And then the people, Don and Brenda Parks, said, okay, now we're headed to prayer service, and I felt obligated to go along, like, what is this? But everybody seemed like they were doing it. Well, in fact, not everybody was doing it. Some of the people just said, hey, bye, we'll see you next week. But
Mm.
I went to prayer service, and for me, that was the most amazing experience that I had ever experienced because I had never experienced people who would pray aloud for other people, who were present and not present. And for me, that was just a life-changing experience to to have that. And we became regulars at Sunday service and at prayer service during that 2 years that we were in Ann Arbor. Yeah, we were regular, and it was about 3 months later that I decided to be baptized.
Wow.
Uh, so, um, yeah.
There, there definitely, in the not too distant past, was a big emphasis that on marrying a member, a church
Right.
member. Um, so I guess I'm not terribly surprised that somebody challenged you with that. However, what a marvelous testimony that you have of why you did, um, and how fabulous the hospitality that you received, especially in Ann Arbor. That's amazing.
It was.
Well, that's a special testimony. I was going to ask you if you can share one or two special testimonies or blessings that you've received that you feel like God's really directed you.
Um, I think I can have two here. One continues in Ann Arbor, um, because Dan was in the Navy Reserve for every um, for every well, after he had done his 6 months basic duty, then he had 6 years of reserves where he went once a month
Yeah.
to his reserve, uh, whatever they
Meetings,
call it.
whatever
Yeah.
they do. Yeah.
Um, so at one point there, early in that year, it was a stake at that time, Detroit International Stake. The pastor
Mm,
asked Dan if he would take attendance every week because the stake wanted to know basically kind of what the numbers were, people who were attending, you
yeah.
know. And Dan, of course, said yes. And I was mad. I said, why did you do that? The weekends that you're not here, I'm going to have to go to church. And I think this was even before I was baptized. I'm going to have to go to church to count people. And I probably could have said no, forget that. But I felt obligated. I don't know. I guess that's what couples do sometimes. And so I ended up going to church by myself then on those weekends.
Hmm.
And that really kind of created an independence in me that I had not had before. That I could do things on my own, that I didn't have to do it only as part of a couple. Uh, so that was one influence. Uh, a second influence, blessing, was we were then a couple of years later we had moved into Detroit for his job then, and the stake was having a retreat at the Kirtland Temple. And I don't even remember what kind of retreat it was, but Wally B. Smith was there. No, W. Wallace. Let me think. 76? Would that have been? Gosh, I'm
Probably
thinking
still
W.
W. Wallace, I
W.
think.
Wallace. Yeah, because
Hmm.
when I look at
Hmm.
that face in my mind now, that was W.
Yeah.
Wallace. Um, and one of the things that he said was that the church has just started a child placement agency. And at that point, we had found out that we were unable to have children. And like, oh, there's an agency for adoption. We need to connect with that, which we did right away. We got started on an application. and so forth. That would have been, I'm thinking 75 or 76 when we had the retreat. So then through that agency, in late 79, we were able to adopt our daughter Johanna. And then in 84, we adopted our son Daniel. And then, as a further miracle, in about 85, after Danny had been with us for nearly a year, the agency called and said, are you sitting down? I was at work at the time. The kids were in school and daycare. And are you sitting down? I said, yeah. And they said, we've been going through the records, filing our records, and have discovered that their birth mother was the same person. Because in both of the adoptions, they had said it was a single adoption, that they were not, for the second one for Danny, that she had not had other children. But
Wow.
as it turns out, she did. And so they are half brother and sister.
Wow.
So that was one of those things I considered a miracle and a blessing to us. So,
Absolutely. Wow, that's amazing. And just going back to when you were talking about taking the attendance and kind of having your own identity, a lot of people don't, younger people wouldn't maybe appreciate that as much as you and I and our generation does, because uh, we were usually part of a couple or identified as so and so's spouse, and
right.
so that's amazing that I can understand why you think that was a blessing, because it was different back in those days,
Yes,
which
it was. It was
not
very
that long
different, and
ago,
I
but
don't think the younger people realize how very different it was.
right, right. And so I'm hoping that some of these testimonies that we're hearing from people, that we're getting from people, are going to make those who listen to it really either remember from their own times or think, wow, that really wasn't that long ago.
One of
But
the things the pastor, his name was Don Thomas, and one of the things he did was he'd ask, if I could do something or if Dan could do something. And if he'd ask, he'd be very clear that he was asking me, and Dan could not speak for me, that we would do, whether or not we would do something or participate in something at church. So
wow,
he
that
was he
was,
was kind of ahead of his time too.
he definitely was. I totally agree with that. Well, my next question is, what do you think it's important for the Community of Christ Church to do now? Um,
Um, Connect with young people somehow, some way. I know that the culture has changed so much. I always wonder kind of what we could have done differently in the past 30 years to continue to connect with people. But we have, and this is something we've talked about at Minneapolis as well. Climate change is very important. We don't know. And Mike Rasmussen says, well, if we don't have a world, what do we need a church for? We've got to work out some way that we can be an influence on, people changing what they think and believe about climate change, and how we can take even the small little steps to do what we can to help influence. The other thing that I think I'm not sure how to do it and how it can be done, but I read and have read several times now, and is it the Surgeon General that put this out, that this epidemic of loneliness,
mm,
that back in the 90s, people, there was one, like maybe 1% of people who said they were lonely. And now this last year or so, whenever they did a survey, it was like 17% of people say they're lonely. And somehow we need to create a community that
Yes.
invites the lonely people to come to join, to be a part of a community. I realize how much of my life has been influenced by the community of people that I've been a part of, so loneliness is not really um, a problem for me. But when I see the younger people, I think even with my kids, some of the people that they know, the way they've made their friendships have been through church and through camps.
Yeah.
And the younger people are not getting that basic structure that
Yeah.
helps them. I know people who don't come to church anymore, but they still have friendships that they created through the church.
Yes.
And so somehow to be able to expand that community to the younger generation. That's, again, I don't know how. But
And I think that's the conundrum for basically all religions, regardless. Everybody has seen the shrinking of their congregations, the aging of their congregations, and we just have to hope, yeah, how do we create those experiences and that foundation? And I'll have to tell you, this question is a tough one, I think, but yet everybody who has answered it differently with something very important. And I think to myself, wow, we need to tell somebody this. We need to have the church and the leadership know about this and put all a bunch of minds together and figure out what can happen. So I appreciate you coming up with those because, as I say, now pretty much everybody is saying we need to somehow reach the young people, and we do know that we need to do that, and it's the $1 million question for everybody. But when you talk about the epidemic of loneliness, that just is heartbreaking. It really is. And putting some good minds to how do we try to resolve that. So thank you for that answer. My next question is, how do you think we can share the gospel with others? And it's either individually or as a church, whatever you think.
I again, I I'm not sure. I don't know. I am an introvert. I am not one to go out and, do the elevator. Here, come to my church, you know, open invitation. I'm, more hesitant because of people have been forced in the past, to listen to people that they don't want to, and so on and so forth. So I hesitate to not to to know how to do that. But one of the things that I'm hoping for in Minneapolis, and I'm still trying to find a building, but I'm hoping for a storefront church that we can lease. And because I said we can, right now we're in the home, but I'm hesitant to, just invite strangers to come into the home.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm hesitant to find because I know we could find another spot in a out of the way place in another church. We could probably use some of their space and stuff. But I said, pretty much we would be invisible. I want to be visible where we can put things in the window that says, hey, come on in. Do you need prayer? Hey, come on in. Do you need help with paperwork? Or do you need help with, a tiny little food shelf in the corner? Or do you need help with, are you lonely? Come in and chat,
Yeah.
or it's cold outside. Come in and warm up for a bit.
Mm.
Things that we could, and actually Dan and I have talked about if we can find a place, maybe staffing it 2 or 3 days a week.
Yeah.
That and that would not be a full-time commitment. It would be a kind of a commitment, but it would be open to people to be able to find us right now. Um, and I thought about too when we had the big church building, people are hesitant to walk into a strange church because they don't know what they're going to encounter. Even with us exploring different churches, you just don't know what the vibe is going to be. But I think a storefront could be a little more opening and welcoming. Hey, we've got a coffee pot on in the corner, and here's some cookies. Just come in and chat,
Yeah.
or whatever. I don't know if we can make it happen because the calls that I've made, I keep encountering roadblocks and finding a storefront, but I'm going to put more effort into that shortly, and we'll see where it
Yeah.
goes from here. And it's a
We,
matter of prayer. If the Lord wants that here, then He's going to have to help me find that spot.
in Red Wing, we are in a storefront. Next door is a tanning salon. They share the building with us, right behind the pizza place. So we're not as visible as we'd like to be, but we're better than when we used to meet at the St. James Hotel. That was definitely a difficult place to invite people in, but I like your idea of being open a couple of days a week, that just so people will know, come and like you say, have coffee, warm up. Um, do you need some groceries or some products? How can we help? The idea of helping people with paperwork, oh my goodness, that's amazing too. Because
Well, and I'm pretty good with that, with people who need help with county applications and so on and so forth. Because I figure half the people homeless here is because they don't know how to negotiate that paperwork to get food stamps and, other help,
yeah,
because and I know people that I've helped because of that, they can't get the paperwork because they don't know how to even start the application process. So and Dan and I have talked about too that we could have a computer there, and do some of our own work there so that we wouldn't be just sitting there waiting.
right, right. But how, yeah, you need to advertise that service, ma'am. That would be,
We need to
I
find the
bet you'd have,
building first.
well, that's true too. That's true too. Yeah, we were fortunate where we are, and our rent is not very high, so it's
Yeah,
good.
that's the other thing.
Right. So you mentioned a lot of different names, but do you have anybody who has been the most influential from church in your life?
Um, I'd probably have to say my husband, Dan,
Well, I
you
was going
know.
to say other than Dan, I'm sure he was. And we're going to get his interview one of these days for sure.
Right.
But
I mean,
is
as
it?
we've grown and as our thoughts on religion and how to be ministers and stuff has changed over the years, that's probably the biggest influence. I've mentioned Don Thomas and Don and Brenda Parks, Jan Hill, Vern Hill, in the more recent past.
Mhm.
Um, there were Ken Miner. We were part of a youth group, actually tech leaders of what
Mhm.
called Youth Venture for Christ back in the 70s. And we've
Okay.
maintained connections with a couple of those people who are I I always think of them at youth, but they're not far behind me in age. And and as I've seen them grow and expand their ministries, a Dave Wilson, a Ken Miner, they've influenced me on how they've continued to minister in different areas of the country where they live now. Um, so yeah,
Well,
there are people.
and and for sure that congregation in Ann Arbor that basically loved you and welcomed you into the church, that was had to be huge.
Yes.
So, my final question is, what do you think is most important for others to know about you, whether it's church related or not?
Um, Now that's one I hadn't really come up with an answer for. I'm shy. I don't step out in front very often. I've learned over the years that I have to sometimes. And I do step up when I've had to, but it's not something I try to do. Um, Beyond that,
Well, I'm going to add my own little postscript on there because I want everybody to know that JoAnne is one of my heroes. And I hope I don't get too weepy in this. You have, when you say you're shy and an introvert, you have accepted the mantle of pastoring a congregation that has dwindled, recently lost their building or sold the building, and you continue to keep people meeting together. You do not give up. You have not yet given up. And so when I think about our little Red Wing congregation, then I think, you know what? If JoAnne can do it, we can do it.
and I'm sitting here thinking, Becky, you're the person who was leading the way because if Red Wing can have a small group there, then I think Minneapolis can keep it together and try to
Well,
minister.
and the other person that I think the same thing about is dear long past Cecil Smith up at Thunder Bay because he did the same thing. And so
Yes.
maybe we're like the Three Musketeers, but it is your example is seen. I just want you to know that. So,
Oh, well, thank you.
well, I appreciate very much you taking the time to
Well,
do
we've gone
this, and
over our half 20 minutes, I think.
that's okay. That's okay. I never know how long they're going to last, and some of them have been shorter than that, and most of them have gone a little over that. But I figure whatever it takes to get the information, to get the full picture. So I am going to say thank you, and I'm going to stop our recording, but I'm going to ask you
Okay.
not to leave quite yet.
Okay.
So I will stop our recording.